Maybe sometimes as doctors, we're a little bit guilty of overselling the stuff that we describe as mild, because when I talk about mild side effects or things not to worry about, I'm really talking about things that maybe you don't have to go, to see a doctor with, for example. So yes, my patients do tell me that they generally have a bit more pain in the arm, particularly with the BioNTech, a little bit more painful. Occasionally, I'm seeing people who felt a bit fluey or a bit achy, but my personal experience has been the majority of my patients don't take any time off work. The majority say, no, it was no big deal, but I have seen a few who've said, I felt a little bit unwell after it, and slightly more than I would typically see after, a tetanus or a diphtheria sort of vaccination. Those sort of things we give regularly. We do see a little bit more of a reaction after the second shot because you already have some immunity, and a little bit more reaction in people who've already had COVID. CDC has produced some really good evolving advice on what you can do when you've been vaccinated in a US context. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that this is going to be very context dependent, because in Hong Kong, we are so focused on population measures and keeping these variants out. I think, honestly, I've had my first vaccine. I was due to have my second, but I'm still anticipating that I'm going to be wearing a mask and I'm going to be subject to a variety of normal social distancing restrictions. And I think as we get increasing evidence of the effectiveness of these vaccines in reducing transmission and mild disease, this will give the governments more confidence to make changes. And I could anticipate that quite quickly in Hong Kong, we might start to see some changes. And I don't know this for certain, but I'm talking to my colleagues in the university. I think one of the things you'd be looking at would be that maybe if you're a close contact, you might not have to go to quarantine if you had a vaccination, and probably in a relatively short time you might have a shorter quarantine period if you've traveled to a particular location. We've already seen the suggestion that maybe we're going to have travel bubbles opening up. So I think we're still going to have some restrictions, and I suspect mask wearing is going to be the norm for a while, if only for the sort of social signaling and the social acceptance within Hong Kong. I think at the moment, if we stop wearing masks, we'd all be, we'd be told to put them back on again, wouldn't we? The key issue there is that in New York and in London, we were probably at about 50% of that herd threshold from the natural infections. So I think the US and the UK has probably, ballpark got there 50% with disease and 50% with vaccination. I think Israel as probably a very good example of a community that's got there with a very high threshold of vaccination. And in some ways, the data from Israel gives us the greatest optimism that we can possibly do that, because there is also, it's a very simple formula, but a slightly extra layer to this. Let's say it's 70% for the sake of argument, for the threshold. The effective vaccination is the number of people who've been vaccinated. So let's say we vaccinate 80% of the people in our population, but then if the vaccine is only 80% effective, then our effective vaccination is 80% of 80, which is 64%. So one of the concerns from a public health perspective is we need a high uptake of vaccinations of a vaccine which is highly effective at preventing even mild disease and transmission. One of the great bits of information from the research that's coming out from these effectiveness studies is these vaccines, particularly the mRNA vaccines that we're getting data on, are really great, much better. I mean, I'm an optimist, but they're as good as I was really hoping for, or even better in terms of the effectiveness in population terms. So that's great. That means that, it means that if we can get a lot of people to be vaccinated, we might be able to do it just with vaccinations alone. But there remains this theoretical argument that we don't know yet if we can do that in Hong Kong without at least some people getting infection. Of course, the hope would be that if we can protect as many people as possible, and especially the vulnerable, the elderly, and those who are at greatest risk, that we may end up with some illness spreading in our population, but not overwhelming our health systems, because that's the danger. The mortality of this disease in the young is generally very low. I mean, there's issues about long COVID, and there's worries about other forms of complications, but in general, children and young people who get COVID are most likely to recover with immunity. So it's as you get older. So we may end up having some natural infection in the community, but if we can get as high a possible level of vaccine uptake, especially in the vulnerable, that's going to allow us to open up sooner. There are some reasons why one vaccine may or may not be better than, because of the different platforms. So people who have significant risks of anaphylaxis, it's allergic reaction, severe allergic reaction, particularly to a fragment of BioNTech or to the actually the ingredient of BioNTech, which is antifreeze actually. And so it's a very unusual thing to have an allergic reaction to. So in general, there isn't really an absolute contraindication. There's a fundamental problem here, and this is a commerce chamber. I'm trying to that ultimately control of all infectious diseases involves a political angle. Restriction of movement and quarantine, and these are political decisions. As a doctor, I'm going to give you a completely apolitical answer. I'm fundamentally a scientist. I want to emphasize that as a scientist, I have absolute respect and admiration for the departments of public health, certainly in Hong Kong, but in China, without a shadow of a doubt. The control of the epidemic and the public health controls within China are really outstanding. As far as the vaccinations are concerned, I made the choice personally to take BioNTech vaccine, and I think that the data set for the BioNTech Pfizer or BioNTech post-BioNTech in Hong Kong is so much larger. We have hundreds of millions of doses. We have lots of evidence of efficacy and effectiveness. I suspect the Sinovac is going to end up being a very good vaccine, and there's a number of reasons which are perfectly rational and logical why we don't have as much data on it, but we just don't have as much data on it. And so I'm a bit of a data nerd, and I've analyzed the effectiveness data, and I've made a decision which has got zero to do with politics and 100% to do with science. And that's how I made my decision. But there's no question that people are making decisions. I'm being encouraged to make decisions which are influenced politically. And so I think we just have to recognize that, be honest and realistic about that. And I think when we're trying to discuss in public health terms, acknowledge the political factors and then try as much as possible to dismiss them, because if we want to get, well, again, I mean, if I could, if we look from a US perspective, if we could look at the pandemic and depoliticize it, we're going to get a better result, I think, wherever we are in the world. I think in the end, we probably will end up with an option for different vaccines platforms, and it may well be. I think it's possibly more likely to work the other way around. I think people who've had Sinovac, which, as I say, I expect to be a very effective vaccine when we finally have the data, may well end up having an mRNA vaccine at a later date, because I think that the platform will allow changing, which will cover the new variants. And so I suspect we're going to see different vaccinations given through this disease process as it evolves. The issue of vaccine passports is slightly different, and I anticipate that what will happen is that we will eventually recognize that all these vaccines are effective as we get more data, and you will be able to travel to China and to the US with whichever vaccines you've had. I honestly can't see, I mean, at the moment, there's a little bit of politicking in place, but I can't see that being an issue personally once we begin to realize and get clear evidence that all vaccines will work. I mean, that would be like, being asked to show which typhoid vaccine you had when you cross a border, and there's lots of different types of typhoid. I mean, we'd think that was crazy. We know they're all effective. So I do think that there'll be different vaccines, but I think that should be based on medical and scientific reasons rather than, for ease of travel and things like that. But I mean, you have raised an important point, because it has been recently said that it'll be easier to get a visa for China if you've had Sinovac, and I think that's going to be a short-term thing personally.